Hello and welcome to the February edition of AML Voices. I'm your host this month, John Byrne with AML RightSource, and with me today is Jonathan Lopez, who's a partner at Jacobson Lopez, and Gary Coleman with Transparency International, an organization, as its name evidences, that works hard on candor and spotlighting issues around the world regarding the need for transparency in regulation, laws, guidances, and policy. So this particular edition is obviously on the broad category of corruption. And when we first began to plan we plan these things several months in advance. We had a series of items that we wanted to discuss, and some we might still discuss today. But obviously, with the chaos going on in the United States, specifically regarding corruption and some of the issues that may no longer be on the table, we thought it'd be really important to have our panelists talk about some of the practical impacts or potential practical impacts regarding some of these changes, again, here in the United States, but also there's been some response globally in other countries, the UK and the FATF, the EU, and that sort of thing. So we want to cover some of those. As always, you have the opportunity to ask us questions. It's in the Q&A box that you see on your screen. Let me start by reminding everybody that back in June of 2021, an issuance by the Treasury Department from all government agencies involved in crafting these were a series of priorities in the AML CFT sanction space. And specifically, one of the 8 priorities, corruption. And reading directly from the description, corruption rots democracy from the inside and increasingly weaponized by authoritarian states to undermine their own democratic institutions, as well as disrupt democratic processes in other nations through foreign influence campaigns. Misappropriations of public assets, bribery, and other forms of corruption affects individuals and entities across the world, threatens the national security of the United States and the global financial system. So let me start off with getting from our panelists, in addition to what I've just read, their definition of corruption and some broad examples of how it impacts us on a day-to-day basis. And Gary, if you don't mind, I'll start with you, and thanks again for joining us.
Of course. Thanks, John. So the Transparency International defines corruption as the abuse of public office or public authority for private gain. And just, I know that there's a lot of sort of conflation as people talk about corruption. Corruption can be criminal, but all crime is not corruption. And so we do want to make sure that we are looking at the abuse of public power. And that's how we define corruption.
And we're going to come back to you because Transparency International every year issues a corruption perception index, which is a good guide and metric on how countries are doing. And it's based on a whole series of factors that we'll ask you about in a bit. Jonathan Lopez, a white-collar crime defense attorney, but a former Department of Justice lawyer for many years. Jonathan, your definition, broadly speaking, besides what Gary's mentioned and what the Treasury outlined of what corruption is and some of the practical impacts that you see.
Sure. So, I mean, corruption in my mind, I like to use as much plain English, and not that Gary and you did not use plain English, but, in the simplest of terms, it's essentially, dishonest or fraudulent conduct by those in power, often involving bribery. But really the concept is, is someone corrupting that office, taking the integrity of that office, and it doesn't have to be public. I mean, you can think of corruption even broad in private context as well. Is someone taking their position and abusing that power and corrupting that sense of integrity and honesty that you think comes with that position and someone in that position should hold? Has it been corrupted? And when we think about it, the United States has always been has always aspired to be a country that is against corruption, frowns on corruption, penalizes corruption. And, corruption goes all the way back to the Teapot Dome scandal and before. But the idea is that we're a citizenry that's above that, and you can trust our systems, you can trust our people. And maybe in another country, you might think about giving some local official a small bribe to get what you want, but that would be unheard of here, right? And now everything feels like it's turned on its head with the latest pronouncements from the White House that seem to say, well, maybe foreign corruption's okay in some circumstances. And by the way, with the Adams case, and I know we'll talk about it, maybe domestic corruption's okay. It's 180 degrees against everything that we aspire to be as citizens in the United States.
You know,
One of the things, go ahead, Gary. I'm sorry. Go.
just one thing that I would add, building on Jonathan's smart use of plain language, when we talk about bribery and corruption, when I'm talking with family or friends or whatever that are not in this space, I think it often comes off as, oh, the bribe was this many millions of dollars and the fine was this, that, and the other thing. And it comes off as a distasteful financial transaction. And just a quick word to say, bribery has consequences. Building inspectors have been bribed to avoid, building codes, later leading to catastrophic collapses that have killed people. Or we've seen where worker health and safety issues have been ignored. Look at the mines in Congo that have led to disability and lethal consequences. And finally, I would say, when you asked about national security, if you look at corruption and bribes, you will also find numerous cases of arms diversion, where literally weapon systems that were meant for police forces or other official actors that we were trying to use to fortify against rebels or U.S. adversaries would end up in the hands of U.S. adversaries or drug cartels. So there's real world consequences to this stuff, and I think it's important just to point that out.
And you folks have done some really good work on explaining some of the impact, like you just mentioned. It could be building codes, but it could be environmental issues, things like wildlife trafficking and those issues as well, a whole broad scope of things. Jonathan, when we first talked about doing this program, we said that we would cover updated cases regarding the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and the more recently passed laws dealing with bribery. You alluded to it in your opening comments. The Attorney General, directed by the President, paused foreign bribery enforcement. Talk a bit about the practical impacts. And one of the things I want to mention to our community out there is I've heard from other lawyers that the FCPA has and you know this better than I, Jonathan, so I want to hear your take, has a 5-year statute of limitations. So even though there's going to be a pause from DOJ and the U.S. Attorney's offices, and you can describe what that means from a practical standpoint, those that pay attention to responding to the need to have robust programs and all that shouldn't sit back and say everything's open right now, because there is the potential opportunity that cases could still be brought. But tell me if I'm right or wrong about that. And then tell us about the FCPA was crafted way back during the Carter administration. So it's been there for quite a period of time. And I know you dealt with that issue while you were at DOJ and obviously since then. So a long-winded way of saying, give us your primer, if you will, on FCPA and other statutes and what the pause means. And what do you tell your clients that it means?
Yeah, so a lot in there. I know the audience here is primarily in the AML and financial community, although not exclusively. And John, you alluded to this, that the FCPA has been around for a long time. It was put together around the same time as the Bank Secrecy Act was put together. Bank Secrecy Act, just a little bit older, but both of them are a product of the 70s, and both of them followed a similar path in that it's been started off as trying to achieve a loftier goal and really BSA, AML, protect our financial system, the FCPA, encourage world actors and participants in the world economy to be all operating on a level playing ground without corruption. And over the decades, each regime has really built up a real structure to it that's been expanded upon. So much so in the corruption context, which really took off in the mid 2000s when DOJ started enforcing it vigorously. So much so that the rest of the world has kind of come along. The landmark case, kind of from an international perspective, was really, Siemens and Daimler, followed by BAE, in the late 2000, 8, 9, 10, time frame. And now, the UK Bribery Act is a pretty serious act. Brazil has gotten in the picture. France has gotten in the picture. So all of that really came from the United States being the beacon and the lead. And now we're pulling back, but these other regimes are still there. Are they as active as the US was? No, but they're all still there and everyone's been kind of on board. So to get to your point of, what does it mean today? Well, there's been this pause. And it's a pause, though. It's not a repeal of the law. The law is still the law. What DOJ is saying is we're just going to pause enforcing the law for a period of time. And as you alluded to, there is a statute of limitations on these offenses. It is 5 years. It can even be longer, depending on whether there's a conspiracy that extends, and there's other kind of mechanisms to extend it well beyond 5 years. And I think most companies right now who have built robust anti-corruption programs, at least not from our clients, the guidance we're giving, when they're looking around and talking with them, and they're talking internally, is, all right, well, look, we're not going to send a message to the field that it's a free-for-all. We still want integrity in our company. We don't want to be exposed to shareholder lawsuits. We don't want to be exposed to opening the door to embezzlement and other bad actions. And we don't want to be exposed to corruption, notwithstanding this pause. So we're messaging, and we've helped our clients message, look, it is still the law. The SEC for public companies is not subject to the executive order. Now, whether they'll do something different or not is hard to say, but they have also anti-corruption powers and enforcement. And corruption issues are still going to be there. And by the way, if you say anything other than that, I guarantee you it will be that free-for-all out there, and you're going to have a lot of problems to clean up later. The real question comes, and I don't mean to get too political here, what happens in 4 years? If there's a regime change, it seems, and the Democrats take control, that's what I mean by that, or another Republican takes control that doesn't view it the same way, then there's going to be a huge uptick in enforcement back. And I think that's what companies and actors out there need to be thinking about, that right now, we are where we are, but this is still a very fluid situation and will remain to be a very fluid situation.
Jonathan, what was the other statute that was crafted recently? We were planning to talk about it, but since they paused everything, give us an update on that.
Yeah, it's called FIPA. So with a P. So the issue with the FCPA, that's always kind of been there, is that the foreign official was not covered by the FCPA. So, for example, if I were to go bribe a foreign official, I could be prosecuted, but the foreign official could not be. And so it was a bit of a gap. And there were, some reasons when the statute was initially enacted as to why they didn't want to, the United States didn't want to be out there charging foreign officials. We went after, DOJ, historically, that's the we, I'm no longer with DOJ, as we've all pointed out, but DOJ kind of solved that problem by charging money laundering as the crime. So foreign officials aren't exempted from money laundering prosecutions the way they are for FCPA prosecutions. So that was one way to tackle, going after foreign officials who availed themselves of the US financial system to take the bribe money. So that was there already. But what FIPA did was actually codify that, look, the taker of the bribe can be prosecuted as well. It purposefully was not included as part of the FCPA because it was felt, at least anecdotally, it was felt that would create too much angst amongst everyone. It would never get passed. So it's actually in a different section of the code. But I don't see that being enforced. I mean, right now it's not specifically under the pause, but I don't see that happening. It's interesting what the AG did. It's not just the FCPA unit that's on a pause, but the kleptocracy unit is effectively dismantled, which is basically trying to civilly go after those that and recoup that money that is subject to that is the proceeds of public corruption or bribery, et cetera. So it's really dismantling the apparatus, or at least putting on hold the apparatus for the United States to effectively combat foreign corruption and the proceeds of foreign corruption.
So they actually disbanded the kleptocracy task force, right? It no longer exists. So it's not paused, it's gone, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's unclear what that quote unquote means. The prosecutors are all still there. They didn't get sent off to the sanctuary, cities task force like others. I've talked to some friends that are still in the department, and some of them are just running out of work to do, and curious as to what it looks like next that they're going to be tackling, because the way the orders written is that, look, if there's a nexus to drug cartels, and the word cartel in this context again goes back to drug cartels. A lot of times people say cartels and you're thinking antitrust cartels, but this is cartels, the drug cartels. If there's a nexus to drug cartels, well, that's great. FCPA cases with a nexus to drug cartels, pretty low occurrence of that. Like, I can't think of really, maybe struggle to find one, and I think I'd probably be stretching to make that work.
Hey, Gary, a couple things, and then I want you to talk about the corruption perception index. I think it's pretty important. But when the pause was issued, you folks issued a press release, and the chair of your Transparency International said the following, kind of building off what you said about neighbors talking to you or whatever. They said, foreign bribery is by no means, as suggested by this is when it was put out, by last night's decision, a routine business practice. So the question for you, and you've sort of already responded to it, talking about some of the impacts, but some of the conversation around the pause was, well, if we're just paying money to somebody so we can get our stuff out of the port, or we just have to pay something so that they'll let us do business, well, what's the harm there? And you've said some of that already, but that's how they're selling this, right? They're saying by pausing enforcement of FCPA, all we're pausing is sometimes you have to glad hand somebody with money to move a contract or something. But it's clearly much more than that, and you folks amplified that in your discussion when it came out. But talk a little bit more about that, and then if you wouldn't mind, what are some of the other jurisdictions doing that you consider admirable in terms of their processes? Because the FCPA was sort of considered, as the gold standard back then. And as Jonathan said, a lot of other countries have adopted things. Give us a sense of what some of the other jurisdictions that you folks believe are not just on the right track, but doing some of the right thing. But first, if I come to you and say, Gary, what's the big deal? All you're doing is paying somebody so we can move some products off a dock and get them in. How is that harmful?
Sure, a lot in there. So a couple of things. One, look, I think people often think, oh, there's a bunch of contractors and they're all vying for a contract, and one of them sort of slips somebody a little bit of money and then they get the contract. Bribery, as we've seen, right, is much more insidious than that, in that you pay bribes so that you could get around. Brazil has some of the strongest anti-deforestation laws in the world. So how does the Amazon continue to get cut down? It's not because there were legitimate, contractors that were just trying to figure out how they can legally get timber. They paid to avoid the deforestation laws. In the Congo, people don't have access to healthcare. They're paying below minimum wage standards. The working conditions are horrific because the mines, the people that have the contracts are able to pay bribes to get around those laws. So there's real harm there. But here's the thing that I think, if putting aside the domestic harms, The issue and the rationale given for suspending the rules is nobody else is really enforcing their foreign bribery laws, and so U.S. companies are at a disadvantage. I'm not quite sure that companies that we've spoken to, including some very large trade associations of businesses, would agree with that statement. Right? The US companies and Western companies are used to working in essentially rule of law type environments, and trying to outbribe your corrupt competition is not actually grounds that you feel comfortable on. We're not going to be able to outbribe the competition in a way that helps US businesses. The second thing is businesses would prefer generally light or no regulation. If there is regulation, then that regulation, the second best thing is regulation with certainty. The worst scenario is regulation with uncertainty, right? And as Jonathan noted, this pause is only harmful to businesses. And let me explain why. One is the 5-year statute of limitations. If you bribe somebody tomorrow and there's a different government in place in 5 years, then you could be investigated. So you don't want to pay those bribes. On the other hand, the pause will likely empower or embolden corrupt officials overseas who will feel more comfortable asking for bribes, saying, oh, you don't actually have to worry about this because there's a pause. Do you pay that bribe? What is your risk tolerance? How do you actually defend yourself? There's more than one company that has said, hey, my defense has been, I can't pay that because I'm not going to jail for you. The third thing I would say is, people assume that you pay the bribe, you get the license, you get the permit, and it's all done. It's not actually how it works for people that have been involved in these situations. We've heard from companies, for example, one company that was trying to get into Guatemala for 3 years, right? And let's assume they weren't paying the bribe, but even if they did, they put money on hold, investment money on hold, waiting to get their permits. But because of bribery and corruption, they couldn't get them, and that money just sat there doing nothing. We've heard other companies that actually invested in infrastructure, for example, in Mongolia and other places, where because of bribes and corruption, after spending as much as $1 billion, had to pull out. So companies don't actually benefit from having murky anti-corruption laws and anti-bribery laws. It's not working for them. And so while there may be, companies that would love to have some reforms of the FCPA, I don't think there's a lot of companies out there that want to turn this into the Wild West. And I think that is a disagreement with the current administration. So there's some real, I think, uncertainty and confusion that creates potential risk and liability.
What are some of other countries doing that you think are doing a good job?
Yeah, so our organization back in 2022 did a study of 47 of the largest exporting countries in the world. So these are the countries most likely to have large multinationals operating overseas, and basically said there were only 2 countries, the United States and Switzerland, that were actively enforcing their FCPA law, or their version of their foreign anti-bribery laws. So I think it has spurred a lot of countries to adopt anti-bribery laws. I do think that there has been uneven enforcement. But increasingly, since that study, and we need to do a second one on this, we have seen more and more countries say, you know what, we're not sure we want the US to go after our companies or, policing for us. And we would rather do this ourselves. And so I do think there's been an uptick in other countries. As Jonathan noted, I think the UK updated its law, and that's doing much better than they were before. We've seen, trying to think, even some stuff coming out of France. They've had some success in going after some companies. And so I do think that there was understanding that we want to take control of policing our own companies and our own economy. And so it has actually been a force for good, and opening markets that I think otherwise were high risk for companies to go into.
And let me just kind of add to Gary, if you don't mind, and John, what you're saying. It's the countries have started to take that position, I think, in part because of exactly what you said. The US was doing a fair amount of enforcement against non-US companies and non-US people. So, the jurisdictional hook for the FCPA was very big, broad, sorry. And so you could bring in a lot of foreign companies and individuals. And in fact, and I don't have any statistics to back it up at my fingertips, but if you take a review of the DOJ enforcement actions over the past 10 years, you're going to see, I would bet the majority are foreign corporations that happen to be listed here or otherwise subject to the US jurisdiction that are getting tagged. And so the US did really a great job of leveling the playing field. And one of the things that the memorandum talks about, and Trump has, talked about, the need to take this pause is because the playing field isn't level. I'm not sure that's so accurate with the majority of countries. Where it is accurate, probably, is Russia and China at the end of the day. I don't know if it's accurate, but they're not sweating US enforcement in the same way a UK company might, or a French company might, or a Brazilian company might. But for the majority of the other actors, the playing field, is not as uneven as suggested. In fact, I had to do an investigation out in the Middle East not too long ago, and I was on behalf of a company, and I went there, and the company in-house counsel was like, well, look, it's different here. The culture is different. If you start asking our agents in this country what their, thoughts of anti-corruption are, they're going to laugh at you because that's the way of business. And I got there and I started to very gingerly talk about anti-corruption and why the US is, enforcing this. And we all, you're working for a US-based company and we got to think hard about how we handle things. They're like, well, you don't have to dance around. We totally get it. Two other companies we work for audit us regularly. Like, this is the first time we're hearing from you. Like, we get it. Yeah. Now maybe they're not doing it in practice, but at least this is not the first time someone's knocked on their door saying, hey, you got to, be mindful of anti-corruption concerns. So truly a lot of progress has been made. And the concern really is, what does that look like now when folks that are, inclined to be cowboys if they can, get a message that, all right, the good old days are back.
We had planned to talk about a couple of cases, and I want to do that. Like I said, we'll come back to Gary on the index and some other things. But Jonathan, would you mind covering two pretty prominent cases? We'll first start with the Senator Robert Menendez case, and why that comes under the category of corruption, and then we'll talk about Adams and the fallout from there. But give the folks the facts, high level of that case. And again, toward the end of this, I want to get from you specifically your advice to financial institutions in terms of, policies in place and training they might need to be able to identify this. But could you talk a bit about those two cases? I'm sure most have read about them, but maybe they don't know all the facts.
Yeah, it's Menendez and Adams compared together. It's like a tale of two cities almost, and the differences of what happened and how they're treated. And Menendez in particular, he's a long time senator from New Jersey, right? And had actually been prosecuted once before, and I think maybe even more than once before. And it kind of always, escaped out of the crosshairs of DOJ and not actually been convicted of anything. But the most recent charges was, basically alleged from like 18 to 22, a lot of improper conduct on behalf of folks in Egypt. And his wife was involved, and potentially even, as alleged by the government, his wife was, kind of the introduction to some of the stuff, and, received gold bars and cash and furniture and all kinds of things in exchange for tampering with, the USDA and imports for food going into Egypt, and trying to tamper with ongoing investigations that were happening out of New Jersey, and, a whole host of other actions that he undertook as part of his position of influence, including, revealing how many people are staffed in the U.S. Embassy in Cairo. It's not classified, that piece of information, but still, a security breach. And everything I'm outlining is basically what's in his plea agreement, and came out in sentencing. I'm sorry, not his plea agreement. That came out through his sentencing. So all of this is, a matter of public record. And it's really, the corruptness that we started off talking about in the beginning, the pure corruptness of a very influential position within the United States government. There were times when I was at DOJ, I worked for the Office of Legislative Affairs for a bit. And, Senator Menendez was an active writer of letters and demanding briefings of various aspects of what he viewed to be impropriety within DOJ. And, it just really gets at, kind of the heart of things when you hear someone standing on such a high horse talking about what's proper, and then all of this information comes out. And that's that corruptness that we're talking about, that we want to have the faith in our institutions. Why I say it's a tale of two cities. He was prosecuted,
Right.
and he's been prosecuted by Democrats, and he's a Democrat, and, held to account.
What's
Adams
the sentencing of that? What did he get sentenced to?
sentenced to 11 years.
11 years. Okay. Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead.
For a variety, of different, not only bribery, but he didn't register as a foreign agent. He was obstructing. There's a variety of different things going on in there. Adams.
And say who everybody knows. Say who that is.
Yeah, the mayor of New York. Well, I'm not as well versed on all of the underlying kind of conduct in play.
Right.
What is clear is what's come out recently, which is that, the DOJ is basically saying we need him to help with immigration enforcement, and he's ideally suited for that. So we want this case dismissed. It doesn't talk about the merits, the facts of the case at all. It doesn't get into any aspects of the underlying, whatever the issue is. It almost doesn't matter what that is. They're saying we don't want him prosecuted. Now, President Trump could solve this problem quite easily by just pardoning him.
Right.
But he doesn't want to pardon him because I'm not in President Trump's head, but it's clear by not pardoning him and by saying, well, we just want him dropped for now, we can always bring him back later, which is what they're saying. He's kind of got Adams on a leash, and it has caused a massive fallout within DOJ with, many resignations, because this is, contrary to the core of folks going in to be prosecutors. The folks that go in to be prosecutors, and can be a long discussion about whether they are overzealous and take advantage of the power or use it judiciously, and with the range of prosecutors that might exist, all of them walk in thinking to themselves, with the exception of every, statistical bad apple that might be out there, that they want to do justice, they want to do good, they want to uphold the law, they want to get at bad actors. And when you see something as clearly outlined as, we don't care what the facts are, we just want this guy because he can help with enforcement, and therefore we're going to drop these charges, it really is, strikes at the core, against the core of what a lot of these folks believe in. And I'm not surprised, that they are courageous enough to say, I'm out of here. I'm not doing it.
What are some of the things he did the specifics because he's dealing with the government of Turkey, right? What just high level? What were some of the things
Yeah,
that you
yeah. I
remember?
mean, again, a lot of, trying to use his office for benefit, trying to
Right.
use his office for personal benefit and benefit, that really outside the realm of what his day-to-day is. It's hard to see how, working with folks from Turkey is benefiting New York, right? But he's using his position of power in order to do things to help himself and help his friends, and that is not what you want out of your mayor.
Right. Gary, you're free to comment on those cases if you want, but then if you wouldn't mind pivoting to a great report that you folks produce on a regular basis, the Corruption Perceptions Index, which gives practitioners an understanding when their clients are dealing with certain countries, what some of the issues are. So if you talk a bit about that and some of the factors that go into the index, but if you have anything to any comments you have on those two cases, feel free.
Um, uh, Jonathan did a great job sort of talking about some of the concerns on the cases. I think with the Corruption Perceptions Index, just so folks know what it is a annual review of 180 countries, I believe, taking a composite of 13 different indices from the World Bank, from Freedom House, from a variety of different sources, sort of combining them. And I'm not a methodological statistician, so it's sort of they put it in, they have a magic sauce, and come up with ratings for these countries. 100 would be very clean. 0 is completely corrupt. No one's at either 0 or 100, but we have some countries that are pretty close. At the top, not surprisingly, you'd have countries like Norway, Denmark, New Zealand at the bottom, Somalia, South Sudan, Venezuela, countries you would also expect. I think just in terms of the US, in this most recent index, we dropped 4 percentage points.
Mhm.
And just to be clear, 1 or 2 percentage points, it could be noise in the data and doesn't really mean much. When you get to 4 or 5 points, you're actually starting to have some statistical resonance. It is after a multi-year slide or stagnation in the US score. So while year to year a statistic or two might not mean much, I do think that it is important to point out that the US, this is now sort of a trend of the US score stagnating or dropping pretty much since 2014, I believe. And so that's a concern. The score for this year actually was compiled from 2024, so it's before Trump took office. And the drop is, if you look at sort of the background data, is largely caused by concerns around the Supreme Court and scandals around conflicts of interest there. The policies, the conflict of interest policies they adopted, I think people were quite skeptical that they were strong enough and that there was an actual enforcement mechanism, and so didn't take that to assuage their concerns. What we've seen in the last couple of months, adding on to a multi-year slide, I think really raises some questions for the direction of the United States. And because the United States is such a large player economically, national security wise, a variety of ways, our footprint is just so huge around the world. We're also seeing other countries sort of follow suit. And so the leadership that has been given up by the US, I think actually has some global implications. And we'll see where that goes and what, the next few years reveal. But I think it's something to certainly watch.
Gary, you folks have been very active in the debate and the passage of the Corporate Transparency Act, and I know we've done programming just on that. But I'm also interested in TI's view regarding the various. There's been court cases. It looks, at least, um, because of the Trump administration's response, that they are supporting keeping the CTA. But obviously, FinCEN has just recently, I think last week, said they're going to extend the deadline to report, but they are going to look at making adjustments and changes. So it's not an elimination as we might have feared, those that think that the CTA is important. And just a quick aside for all us FATF nerds out there, we're being evaluated, the mutual evaluation process of the U.S. And if they were to make massive changes or an elimination of the CTA, that would certainly harm our evaluation. But talk a bit about your folks' involvement and you particularly in the CTA. And I know where we stand right now could change tomorrow with all the things going on, but just in general, what's your perspective?
Yeah. So, interestingly enough, despite all that's going on with the FCPA and the task force klepto capture and the kleptocracy asset recovery initiative and all the things that we've been talking about, interestingly enough, the AML regime that we have seems to at least struck a nerve in the Treasury Department, and they are supportive. I'd like to believe that it's in part with the coalition that many of us built that is truly one of the broadest coalitions I've ever worked on in my 30 or 40 years of doing this work, right? I mean, we had, Friends of the Earth on the same bill as Dow Chemical and the big banks on the same bill as some of the consumer protection groups, civil rights groups and the Fraternal Order of Police. Yeah. And so that coalition seems to have helped, I think, influence that just across the political spectrum that these laws are important and they're worth keeping. The administration did, so there are multiple lawsuits trying to strike down the law as unconstitutional. I think there's 11 at last count. The ones that are most sort of far along are in the 5th, 4th, and 11th Circuit of Appeals. So far, the courts, with the exception of a couple of lower district courts that struck it down, most of the decisions are going in favor, including a recent Supreme Court decision that lifted an injunction against the law. But the most important thing is that throughout this entire process, the Trump administration has been filing briefs and the Justice Department has been filing briefs in support of the constitutionality with, I would say, and Jonathan, you could, if you've seen them, you could say otherwise, but my understanding is these briefs are quite strong. I mean, it could have come from us in their sort of full-throated support of these laws. In terms of FinCEN's delay, I think given the court cases, given concerns in Congress, and there's a delay bill going through Congress, we didn't oppose the delay. And just to be clear on the delay, it's sort of a delay, right? When the law passed, it said businesses will have up to 2 years once the rules are finalized to comply. FinCEN then on its own said, well, it's up to 2 years, and we think it's a pretty simple process, so we're going to make it 1 year. The delay merely brings it back to the original 2 years in the law. So we didn't oppose it. We didn't, look, if that helps businesses and gives a little bit of relief to, the pressures that some politicians are feeling to adjust the law, we're not going to fight that, especially since it's caught up in court, and I doubt that those decisions are going to be made before the end of the year anyway. So the delay bill is not so much a concern. I think with some of the adjustments that Treasury and FinCEN are looking for, and they're opening up a sort of mini review process of the rules, and they're asking for feedback, there are some adjustments that I think are reasonable. We do want to watch and make sure that they don't do anything to undermine the fundamentals of the law. But for example, we had urged FinCEN when creating the form, just the form that businesses apply with, they created a form that wants to make sure that they're catching all the information from potentially complex companies. 80, 90% of these companies, over 70% of all companies in the United States are non-employer firms. There's one person, right? Why not create like the IRS has, sort of a easy form or something for simple companies? You don't have to it's an 8-page form, just simplify the form. So there's changes and tweaks like that we think could actually alleviate some of the burden on business without undermining the law. And we're going to encourage FinCEN to make those changes, but not go further. And we'll see.
Barry, I 100% support you on that. As a small business, we have our own firm now 2 years, and my partner and I broke off from big law. Never thought about any of this in any detail. I I'm in this field. I looked at the form. I'm like, I'm gonna have my accountant do this. Why am I doing this? This is very complicated. And
Look, and there's some more subtleties, and then I'll stop. But within the rules that I think, well, actually, there's been a lot of misinformation, right? I think FinCEN should just clarify that the law says it's got to be a willful violation. And you see tons of information coming out that if you forget to file, you're going to be, up to 10 years in prison and or $10,000 fine and 5 years in prison or whatever it is. That's just not true. And so FinCEN should come out with guidance clearly saying we're not going to go after anybody for negligence. We can't go after anybody for negligence, but in case there was concern, we just want to clarify that. So there's certain things that I think they could really double down on and make sure that people understand the simple version of what the law is trying to do. It's an 8-page form. They're only supposed to collect 4 pieces of information: your name, your address, your date of birth, and a driver's license number or passport number. Why is it 8 pages? So yes, Jonathan, I'm totally with you on this, and we are going to urge FinCEN to make some simplifications we think can clear up a lot of this stuff.
Well, Jonathan and Gary, all can tell you is I have an LLC and it took me 15 minutes. So maybe I did it wrong. So
you're a genius.
We'll figure it out. Jonathan, I want to come back to you. Part of the reason the category of corruption is one of the priorities is because there's an anticipation and I think a direct obligation if banks suspect corruption or at least suspicious activity that could be elements of corruption to file suspicious activity reports. We could spend an hour talking about it, but just in a short, brief way, if I'm calling you in to talk to my institution about what are some of maybe the red flags or just some things to consider potentially filing a SAR under the category of corruption, what immediately comes to mind?
Yeah, well, look, there's a couple of things that immediately come to mind. Obviously, PEPs, obviously geography, high risk jurisdictions, those kinds of things. FinCEN in 2022 issued an advisory on kleptocracy and foreign public corruption and helpfully identifies some of those very red flags and gives some case examples. I think the issue for corruption, it's relatively easy to spot if your business is mostly domestic and it's an outlier when you're dealing with international wires and international participants. I think your FIU is going to be more attuned to seeing, well, wait, what is this? We're not used to seeing wires in and out of, pick your country. For the larger institutions, I think it's a much bigger challenge. I mean, if you look at the corruption-related cases that involved our financial institutions, such as, Jules Baer, Bank Hapoalim, those are FIFA cases, or Goldman, used to lots of international transactions. And I think I know for a fact in Bank Hapoalim, and I think in Jules Baer as well, but also in Goldman, there were insiders, right? And that's kind of a different category than what we're talking about. What we're really talking about is assume no insider and assume, you're monitoring thousands and thousands, if not tens of thousands of international transactions. This is really hard to spot from a corruption standpoint. I mean, Senator Menendez, he had gold bars and cash. He wasn't even using the banks all that much. Right. So I think some of the things that I would recommend are, obviously watch for your PEPs. Negative news can be really helpful. It doesn't obviously tell you what's happening, but it might be able to put you on a higher alert to be thinking about what's happening. Foreign negative news, less trustworthy, maybe, than U.S. news, although I think we can have another hour on whether U.S. news is trustworthy. But thinking about, how to round out the picture of what might be unusual, a little bit more outside of the box when it comes to corruption. But it's hard. It's hard to see it if you're in the business of moving lots of international transfers.
we don't try to talk products generally here, but we do have an adverse media part of RightSource, just tossing that there. But I totally agree with you. That's only one factor. It's only one thing you look at. Gary, we have about 10 minutes left, but I do want to get your take on two things that we didn't talk about. We mentioned one, but we didn't talk about the other. What does Transparency International think, if anything, on this particular issue? The fact that members of Congress, as long as we can both remember, have been able to trade in stocks. And that's a bipartisan comment because they're both sides are doing it. It seems to me, I'm a lawyer, been doing this forever. You obviously get access to a lot of information that the public doesn't always get access to, and that's an understatement. Have you guys ever weighed in? I'm sure other groups have. I'm just curious your take, because that seems to me to be so much opportunity for potential corruption as we broadly define it.
Yeah, it's interesting. That issue is one of the more unusual ones in Congress because it doesn't break down along party lines.
No, not at all. Yeah.
You have bipartisan opposition to those kinds of limitations.
Yeah.
And by the way, you have bipartisan support
Mhm.
for those kinds of, right? So it has a difficult time getting through because the leadership of both parties gets mixed messages, and so they just keep punting it down the road, and the bill can't get through because you have both sides. It's not a clear cut, oh, we have
Right.
mostly one party, and if we just get a few from the other party, then we can get it across the finish line. It's sort of completely a jumbled mess. But yes, I think that does raise questions. I think it would help to give people assurance that markets are not being manipulated, or members of Congress are not there to benefit themselves. Look, it goes without saying, right? Everybody knows that opinions and confidence in Congress is at some kind of record lows, and these are the kinds of things that add to that skepticism. So we would support the law. I think that because there's bipartisan support, there's a possibility at some point it can get through, but that's not going to happen immediately.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. It just seems, I think, if the American people actually, I don't think they pay attention, obviously. If they knew this, these folks are sitting in classified briefings and getting access to information on pharmaceuticals, on environmental issues, and then there's been some clear good investigative reporting that have shown a direct correlation between those hearings or those closed briefings and somebody benefiting, selling or purchasing. It doesn't make any sense that that's not something that in previous years wouldn't have been on everybody's list. But obviously,
There was a push a few years ago, and they
yeah,
thought they could get something through. And it was bipartisan opposition at the very top leadership of Congress. I mean, Nancy Pelosi was one of
right.
the detractors that blocked the bill, just to be clear, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, that was probably the best shot at getting something through. And we'll see. I don't know that there's appetite in this Congress to bring it back.
Yeah, and imagine, so now that I'm on this side of the table, the defense side of the table, which I have been for quite some time, I'm more sympathetic, surprisingly enough, to the defense views of the world. And imagine you're accused of insider trading as a regular citizen and are aware of all the statistics and correlations, Gary, you're talking about. How does that make you feel? And frankly, I'm dealing with clients right now who are like, well, wait a second. Why am I being investigated for things that our leadership seem to be doing? Like, I don't understand what's happening. It's not a very satisfying position for them to be in, and not a very satisfying, answer that I can provide.
Gary, I did a podcast, I think it was late last year, and it was based on a report done by, I think it was the Basel Institute of Governance. It does some really good work, but it was about the dangers. I know, I think actually they've done some work, but I think actually our previous Treasury Department did as well. How people could invest, foreign citizens could invest in the U.S. and sort of get to the front of the line in terms of citizenship. Right. So that's been, I forgot what they call that, but that's been something that they say is problematic, or they did say is problematic. But then we just had the other day the president unveiling this gold card situation, which and fill in the gaps if I'm overstating this, but if you pay $5 million to get this card, you again jump to the head of the line to become a citizen or something along those lines. Talk briefly about that. I know it just came out and we don't know how it's going to be implemented and all that sort of thing, but isn't that the sort of process that would just welcome corruption?
Uh, so the golden visa problem which is how it's referred to,
Okay, yeah,
has
yeah,
been a problem for many years. A number of countries do this. It's not unique. In fact, in the United States,
right,
what he's suggesting, although it needs to be seen exactly what he means, we don't have the details,
right,
but it could essentially be an expansion of a current program. So it's not quite the same as, we're not going to enforce the FCPA, or we're disbanding some of the kleptocracy initiative. Like it's an expansion of an existing program that I believe is around, if you pay $800,000, if you invest $800,000 in
right.
what's supposed to be economically distressed communities, then you can get to the head of the line, get the visa. There's been a lot of concerns about abuse of that because metropolitan areas are generally considered investment worthy. Here in the DC area, a distressed area could include Bethesda, which, if anybody knows the DC area, is one of the wealthiest suburbs of the city. So there's problems with the program just in terms of its value. But in terms of corruption, I believe Transparency International actually did a report on golden visas around the world, and it is a place in which corrupt leaders looking to move money out of their own country because they don't want it, right? If you deposit millions of dollars in a local bank, somebody might actually notice, but depositing it, moving it to, you're not yet sanctioned yet, so you could actually use the US financial system and moving it here. You could do, easily, and you can invest in the United States. So they are vehicles that have been abused, and they are high risk of corrupt. I'm not saying everybody that gets one is corrupt,
Sure,
but
sure.
it is a vehicle that has increased concerns around corruption. Moving it to $5 million on the one hand could reduce the number of visas because not everybody can afford 5 million. I mean,
Right.
you can afford 800,000, you're not poor, but it may reduce, but it also means that higher risk individuals are more it could become more concentrated. So it is something that we are concerned about. We obviously don't support it. We think the US should actually get rid of its golden visa program and do visas and passports and citizenship based on a variety of, merit-based selection, if you will.
Somebody mentioned, and you're correct, and I apologize, I didn't know the actual name. Besides Golden Visa, citizenship by investment, and then some of that money gets used for positive things like development, that sort of thing. But I do think they should read your report. Treasury, I don't did one, and I believe the Basel Institute of Governance about some of the potential challenges in terms of what financial institutions may want to do regarding filing, even SARs or doing some more due diligence. We only have a couple minutes left. Jonathan, I want to give you a chance for some takeaways here. We've covered a lot. We could obviously spend another hour on a bunch of things, but again, what's your big takeaway for the financial institution AML community regarding corruption going forward?
Yeah, no, everyone should just, this is going to sound very basic, but, keep doing the hard work that you're doing. Keep doing your jobs. Keep looking out for all the things that you're looking out for, being inquisitive, raising things. I wouldn't take the foot off the gas pedal. Keep doing your jobs. That's really my pep talk and my thought of how to handle the situation. It's too much in flux. We got to just keep steady and keep moving forward.
Gary.
Yeah, so I would agree with that. I think it's high risk to take your foot off the pedal. We don't know where things are going to go. The one thing that we didn't talk about, and I'll just throw out real quickly, is new rules around the real estate and private investment sectors. And so, if anything, there's been an expansion of the AML program and regime at Treasury. All of those rules are going to kick in at the end of the year, unless something changes.
Right.
But I would agree. We don't know what the future is going to bring, and there is risk and liability. So would very much encourage people, do what you're doing. You've built up really strong compliance programs. You've invested a lot. You have really good people there. Keep on keeping on.
I want to thank Jonathan Lopez and Gary Coleman and our audience for staying with us. We will cover this. We'll continue to cover this and other issues throughout the year. Next month, our webinar is going to cover crypto. I just want one final point I want to make before we sign off. We have a tremendous number of dedicated public servants who are partners to financial institutions and adjacent industries and adjacent entities in the community. We need more than ever to support our law enforcement and other government partners during these tough times. All of us know people that are in the government right now. They're going through major changes and chaos, and it's really important that the AML community stand up and support those that work so closely with us. And any success that we have in the AML community is due in large part to partnership. So we need to be strong partners and work with our law enforcement folks and help them through these tough times. Thanks everybody for being with us today. This is this edition in February of AML Voices. We'll see you next month.